Hi everybody. Today is part 2 of my Causes of World War I lecture. And just like last time, I want you to really think about the different causes of the war and how different countries had conflicting perspectives about why they were going to war and where within those countries you see different levels of enthusiasm for the war. And we'll really dig into that idea today. So just like last time, I want you to remember I'm MANIC. So last time I dwelled on I for a little bit with imperialism. It's a pretty complicated long-term cause, so I wanted to spend some time on that. And today we're going to talk about the other causes. So militarism, alliances, nationalism, industrialization, and the culture of violence. So I want you to think again, what's the difference between some of these long-term causes? So which ones have been going on for a really long time? And then what are some of the immediate causes that are kind of like triggers? So when you think about causes of something, you need to think about kind of stoking a fire, right? So you've got these big fat logs that build for a really long time. Those are the long-term causes versus your kindling, which is going to burn really fast and hot and usually needs a spark. So the spark in the causes of World War I is, of course, the assassination of the Archduke. But you've got these big fat logs like imperialism building for a long time. This culture of violence was really a long-term cause. And then you've got some shorter-term events that are going to be kind of faster burning kindling that are really ready to catch that spark. So militarism, I would say, is kind of a medium range cause. It had been going on for a while. The first dreadnought, which is this ship you see here, the HMS Dreadnought, was built in 1906. And this was basically a really fancy ship. It was really well suited for war. It was fast. It was maneuverable. And it had a lot of military capabilities. Now, if you remember Wilhelm II, the grandson of Queen Victoria, he was really envious of his grandmother's navy and eventually his cousin George V's navy, and really wanted to match that naval superiority because that would help with his place in the sun, with imperialism. So you get this naval race between Britain and Germany, with them trying to kind of match dreadnought for dreadnought. And that's going to lead to a massive increase in military spending. Now, when people have a lot of military spending going on, Eisenhower would call this the military-industrial complex. It's like they need a justification for using those weapons, right? So it's kind of, I think, mentally allowing countries to get into a place where they're thinking about the war to come. Now, I want to take a minute to look at some numbers here. So these are the total defense expenditures from the great powers. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on one side, and France and Britain on the other, from 1870 to 1914. Now, you'll notice Russia isn't in these stats, so that will be important in a second when I show you some other numbers. I want you to pause the video now for a second. And I want you to look at this data for a second and just write down one bullet point in your notes about what this chart is telling you. I want you to tell me one bullet point about what you see, and then ask yourself, like, what do you wonder about these numbers? Okay, so pause the video and I'll give you just a second to jot down those notes. Since I'm on pause, I'm going to keep talking. But I want you to think now, this is kind of how I would summarize it. So from 1870 to 1914, defense spending of the great powers basically quadrupled, right? So you would have to look at the range of dates, 1870 to 1914, and then also just kind of what's the trend the numbers are telling you. You're not going to remember 94 million pounds in 1870 and 398 million pounds in 1914. That's too hard. Just remember that it quadrupled. Look for big trends when you're trying to remember these kinds of details. Some things that I wondered, these are kind of the questions that lead to your analysis. So if the first bullet point is your evidence, answering these kind of I wonder questions, that's your thinking, that's your analysis. So my question is, did all 5 powers quadruple? Is there one power that's spending more than others that's really making these numbers look skewed, right? Because it doesn't have it broken down by country. My next question would be, did one increase more than the other, right? So that was kind of related to that last question, but I think that you'll see on my next data here that Germany is really exploding more than some of the others. What does defense spending entail? Is this all money spent on dreadnoughts? Is what other kind of buildups are happening? Are they really getting prepared for war, like building uniforms and things, or are they just building ships? So kind of breaking down those numbers further, I think would be interesting. You might not have the answer to these, but these are the kinds of questions you can ask in your essays and think about possible answers to those and how that might make these numbers make sense. That's a kind of analysis that an AP or an IB exam really wants to see. Where do these numbers come from? I don't have a source listed on here. Are these reliable numbers? Did I just make these numbers up? You don't know unless you've got some sort of citation, right? And that's why citations matter. You want, as a researcher, to be able to track down these numbers and see where other people get them from, to find out if they're reliable numbers. Were militaries exaggerating their numbers? That would be something that would be sort of interesting to see, right? That would lead to tell you more about these governments. I'm going to tell you real quick. These come from a website called historyteacher.net. A history teacher in New York put together a bunch of really fantastic PowerPoints, and I took the numbers from her. Now, if I were citing this in a paper, that's probably not a great citation. I would want to know where she got her numbers from. I imagine she got them from the textbook that she uses, but I don't know for sure. You could track her down and ask her. That would be one way to get to that answer. But there's probably other ways you could verify these numbers, and that's what I would cite in an academic paper. Now, for your IB and AP exams, this is fine. You can just know that stat. Nobody's going to question you on that. You don't need citations, right? Because you're writing basically a timed essay. Now, this next one, I want you to think a little bit about how you would summarize these. And I actually forgot to have that next bullet come in, so you're going to see it right there now. But think about it for a second. How do these numbers compare to the previous numbers? So the last ones were in total pounds. And these are showing me, these are answering some of those questions I had, like Germany's increase in defense spending is going up significantly, right? So I could say, if I was going to summarize this chart, between 1910 and 1914, defense spending increased significantly, with Germany spending or increasing their spending by 73%. Now, can I really compare that to that last chart, though? Let's go back for just a second. So these were in millions of pounds, and this is a percentage increase in defense expenditure. So it's hard to know, because we can see that Germany is growing, right? But my question is, where'd they start out? In 1910, was Germany spending as much as Britain? Were they catching up? Were they exceeding them in this case, or were they just trying to play catch up with Britain? That's another interesting question. So I think statistics are often really misinterpreted on AP exams or any kind of document-based question. So you need to kind of think about what they're showing you here. And in this case, it's a little bit like comparing apples to oranges. You've got total numbers here and percentages here, so you have to be careful how you break those down. So looking at those, that's kind of what you see, right? You've got millions of pounds versus percentages. Just to kind of let you look at these numbers again, like I said, apples and oranges. Now, looking at alliances, this is our next argument. We talk about the triple entente a little bit, and that actually comes in sort of three stages. So first you have one, I think, really important term to go back here to is the reinsurance treaty. So when Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany, he had created this treaty between Russia and Germany. And that basically was saying, like, we agree to stay out of each other's business. Well, then Bismarck's fired in 1890, right? Wilhelm II fires Bismarck because he wants to have a bigger role in the government. And Bismarck was just kind of a hard guy to do that with. So he hires a couple of incompetent chancellors, Hohenlohe and Caprivi. One of them even saying, like, hey, look, I've got a list of like 8 reasons why I'm incompetent, right? But they don't know about the reinsurance treaty, and they're not a mastermind of alliances and sort of diplomacy like Bismarck is. And so that reinsurance treaty lapses. So that, and the reason I bring that up is that's going to be the treaty that then will lead to this first entente. So when the treaty lapses with Germany, Russia's going to say, well, if we can't have an alliance with Germany, we better go look for somebody else. And that will lead to the Franco-Russian alliance. Now, England and France, not traditionally getting along, right? So that will lead to the Entente Cordiale, which is bringing England and France closer together after they resolve some of their conflicts at the Fashoda crisis. And then we've got to bring England and Russia together. So we've really got the most conservative monarchy in Europe, in Russia, and a pretty progressive one in England, which with a lot of checks from Parliament on George V's power, or I guess at this time it was probably still Victoria. So that's how you're going to bring those three countries together into this triple entente. Now, entente means understanding. That's not the same as an alliance. So that's something that we'll need to talk about in a second. On the other side, we've got a triple alliance. So Germany and Austria-Hungary, kind of natural allies in some ways, and a lot of that is due to Bismarck's smoothing of Austria's feathers after the Austro-Prussian War. They then bring Italy into the fold as well, and that's going to lead to the triple alliance. But I would argue the alliance is a little bit stronger than the entente. An entente is an understanding. Alliance is like, if they attack you, we will do this, right? It's much more spelled out. So your question to ask yourself is, how strong were these alliances? If we're making this argument that this is a cause for World War I, could alliances be broken? Like, how ironclad were they? How strong was this entente? I would argue there's something stronger here. There has to be a willingness to go to war for these alliances to be upheld. And we'll see a really exciting, well, I think it's exciting, example of this with Italy in just a second. So once war breaks out, the Great War starts on July 28th, 1914, and we'll come back to the July crisis of 1914 after the assassination of the Archduke. So the Archduke's assassinated on June 28th. The war, the first declaration of war, doesn't come until a month later, on July 28th. So we'll get into that on a different day. But once that war breaks out, we'll see how these alliances shake out. And those are just the dates of the war there for your reference. So we've got the Allied powers versus the Central Powers. But didn't we just say that the Allies were, the Triple Alliance was on this side? I always find that somewhat confusing. So the Triple Alliance becomes the Central Powers, but it sounds like Alliance would go with Allies. So you just have to kind of remember that it's the opposite. The Triple Entente become the Allies. So the Triple Entente leads to the Allies. The Triple Alliance leads to the Central Powers. Now, on the Allied side, we've got England, France, and Russia, right? Those were the Triple Entente. And then Italy over here in 1915, they were on the other side, but in 1915, they signed the Treaty of London and agreed to fight with the Allies and open a southern front against Austria-Hungary. So that right there, you've already violated the argument that alliances lead to the war because Italy just switched sides. So obviously they're not that strong. Now, what I would say is that these alliances are going to make the war from sort of a small localized event in the Balkans to this larger global conflict. And I really do mean global, because when you look at the colonies of all these countries, you've got people from all over the globe fighting in this, localized Balkan conflict becoming much larger. In addition to Italy joining the Allies, the United States will join in 1917. They do stay neutral for quite a while, and we'll talk about how the U.S. comes into the conflict later. But they are very late on the stage. They effectively don't have a large number of troops to Europe until like early 1918. And then we also have these two smaller countries, Serbia, really involved in the outbreak of the war, and we'll talk about that, and Romania also sort of involved in those early years, but neither of them are really going to put up a big, a large number of troops. Now, just to go back, I don't know if you just saw here, but Russia disappeared, right? So Russia in 1917 is going to have a revolution, which is a whole other separate discussion. So they will disappear from the Allied side in October/November of 1917. We'll get into that later. On the Central Power sides, we have Germany. And Germany really does in some ways stand alone because they have the largest force, the largest military. They're in some ways, the big industrial power fighting the rest of the world because their allies, Austria-Hungary, really just doesn't have the industrial output to put a lot of troops and machine guns and soldiers on the field. They do have a southern front against Italy, which is interestingly largely fought on skis, if you want to look into that. The Ottoman Empire also is going to be kind of a less equal partner in the Central Powers. They get involved in October of 1914, but there's one big battle fought, the Battle of Gallipoli against England, which is also kind of interestingly an amphibious invasion of the Ottoman Empire, where they put up a big fight. But the Ottoman Empire's got a lot of internal conflicts that's going to make this kind of complicated and not an equal partner with Germany. And then Bulgaria and Finland, both of those, Bulgaria is going to get involved on the Central Powers side, largely because they're in conflict with Russia against the wars on the Black Sea. And then Finland is going to be basically trying to break away from Russia, and that's why they'll fight with the Central Powers. Okay, so here are our alliances. We've got Nicholas II of Russia and George V of Britain, Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, and President Poincaré of France are all fighting on the Allied sides. And then the Central Powers, you've got Wilhelm II of Germany and Enver Pasha of what will eventually become Turkey, and then Franz Josef of Austria-Hungary, who I just want to take a second to appreciate his facial hair for a second, because those mutton chops really are kind of second to none. He's sort of an interesting character too. His heir was killed in a murder-suicide called the Meyerling affair, if you want to look more into that. And then his next heir, the Austrian heir who's killed in Sarajevo that starts the war, is actually his nephew. So he'd lost two heirs, and his wife had been assassinated earlier in the century. And so he's really, had a lot of loss and devastation. Okay, and then we've got, basically, I just wanted to point out these three cousins. We've got Nicholas II and George V of Britain. I mean, really virtual twins, if you look at them side by side. They're actually cousins on their mother's side. So these two are not related through Queen Victoria. Nicholas II's wife, though, was also a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So he and his wife are cousins with George V from different sides of the family, which, yes, is a little incestuous and weird, and also how you keep titles in the family. But we'll see some really tragic consequences of that, basically royal inbreeding, when we look at the Russian Revolution and hemophilia, which Queen Victoria had passed down to Nicholas II's son, because it was carried by her daughter, Alexandra. And then Wilhelm II, their cousin, fighting on the other side of the war. These two, by the way, Nicholas II, when the Russian Revolution broke out, he asked George V for asylum, and George said no, which is a pretty heated family relationship. And then, of course, Nicholas II and his family would be assassinated in the basement by the Bolsheviks. So, family relationships can get a little heated in Europe. And then here's their grandmother, Queen Victoria. Okay, the next cause that we're going to look at is nationalism. And nationalism, I want you to think of this as kind of extreme patriotism. I do think there's a bit of a difference. Like, it's one thing to be proud of your country, but it's another thing to be so proud of your country that you see yourself as superior to everybody else, right? So nationalism can be both constructive, like it brings all of these German states together, but also destructive if it's a reason to go to war. So nationalism is really going to disrupt the balance of power in Europe, in part because of the unification of Germany and Italy. If we go back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, one of the things that they had decided there was that no one country should become so powerful that it can overwhelm other countries. And the unification of Germany is bringing together quite a lot of powerhouses. So Prussia especially had a really strong military. Hanover and Bavaria were no small kingdoms either. And really the whole balance of power established at the Congress of Vienna didn't include a unified central Germany, right? It included Prussia as kind of an upstart country. So basically that whole balance is just going to be all off kilter. And then you also have to add a unified Italy, which disrupts the balance of power because Austria had gotten northern Italy in the Congress of Vienna, and now they've basically lost that territory. So things are just shifting, is I think the big idea here. There's also a big disruption of the balance of power because of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is often called the sick man of Europe, and that's in part because nationalism is very destructive to these multi-ethnic empires. It was the same problem for Austria-Hungary. Within Austria-Hungary, for instance, you have Germans, Magyars, Croats, Slovaks, Czechs, Poles, Italians. Like there's all these different ethnic groups coming together in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's hard for nationalism to exist in an empire that's made up of so many different peoples, all of them kind of scrambling for some autonomy. So in Austria-Hungary, for instance, the Magyars had already been given some autonomy within the empire, and that led to the creation of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, or the dual monarchy. And so you can see other ethnic groups that are pushing for similar kind of autonomy, or really just to break away. If we look at the Bosnian crisis of 1908, that's how Austria had taken this territory. This had not been a part of Austria. I'm just kind of pointing at the map here. I hope you can see that. This is a very multi-ethnic empire, and that's what this map is about. You can see that you've got Serbs kind of spread all along here. Now, Serbs were Slavic, right? They spoke a Slavic language, so Slavic meaning like basically it's related to all of the Russian and Serbian or Serbo-Croat are Slavic languages. So they're seeing in that linguistic similarity an ethnic similarity as well. And that idea of pan-Slavism, so pan, like worldwide, right? Or big Slavism is bringing all of the Slavs together. And Russia will really see itself as kind of the mother of all Slavs. And so when you have Slavs resisting against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia will be trying to come to their, becoming to their aid, which is what happens in June of 1914. This area here, this is the Balkan Peninsula, and the Ottoman Empire had controlled this for quite a while. And actually, if you look back at the 1400s, you'll see people in this region talking about their defeats, or looking back on their defeats or celebrating their victories. And so this has been a contested area for a long time. Well, as the Ottoman Empire crumbled, Russia was kind of trying to take this territory, as was Austria. So that's creating conflict between the two. Russia had always wanted this warm water seaport out of the Black Sea, and control of this would give them better control over, this would get them out through the Aegean into the Mediterranean. And Austria-Hungary was looking for more ports along the Adriatic and just more territory. I think the next idea we need to look at with nationalism is a specific moment in time. Now, this is interesting looking at it as a cause of World War I, because the August days of Berlin are in early August of 1914. This is after Europe is at war. By early August of 1914, basically everybody had declared war on everybody else. So the war has already begun. So we have to be careful how we talk about it as a cause, because how can it be a cause if the war had already broken out, right? But I think what you have to do is look at nationalism in this case as a moment where you're looking at existing emotions, existing feelings, and how that's a reflection of what drove people to war in the first place. So Peter Fritzsche talks about this in Germans into Nazis, which you guys have read a chapter of. He talks about these parades as kind of a war enthusiasm, that there's these spontaneous parades that break out around Berlin with people just rushing to the streets, so excited to go to war, to kind of make Germany amazing, to really craving some sort of national symbol. They didn't really have like a national holiday yet, for instance. So this was like a moment of a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of parades. You've probably noticed here the guy in the crowd. This is a very famous picture of Hitler, who claims to have been at this parade. Now, it's possible this picture is doctored, but sort of legend goes that when they were talking, the Nazis were talking, a bunch of Nazis were in a room talking about, great moments in German history. This is one, and they were looking at some pictures, and Hitler said, "Oh, I was there." And then the photographer went through the crowd and found his face. So this kind of war enthusiasm then really demonstrates that there was a willingness and an excitement to go to war, that people really did think that the war would be over by Christmas. That's what they said, that by December, everybody would be back home. And why wouldn't they think that? That's how wars had gone. If you look at the wars of German unification, for instance, the Austro-Prussian War is also called the 7 Weeks' War because it was very fast. Technology had changed, though, and so that's not going to be the case anymore. The other thing that's interesting about this article from Peter Fritsch is how much he talks about who didn't show up at these parades. All of these people very excited to go to war, but is that really a measure of the country? Like, is the country really want anything? No, you've got people who stayed home, people who specifically didn't go to these parades, people who held counter demonstrations, right? And the group that he talks about the most are the socialists. And there was a fair amount of socialist resistance to the outbreak of war because they saw it as sort of an imperialist project, like that this wasn't really a war about the workers, this was a war about basically capitalists fighting over resources, which I think is probably a fair criticism. I mean, a lot of this was rooted in expanding markets, in expanding raw material resources, right? So I don't think that that's totally wrong, but I also think that it's maybe a little bit simplistic too. Now, the other big thing that's our next cause is industrialization. And again, you have to be careful how you talk about this as a cause because there's two pieces. On the one hand, there was a drive for resources, and that was kind of behind the imperialistic competition between countries, right? That they wanted markets for their finished goods and they wanted raw materials, that they're pulling all of that out of Africa and Asia and so on. So that's how it's sort of a long-term cause. And it's a cause for the nature of the war. And I'm specifically pointing at these two industrial developments. So on the right, we have a picture of soldiers basically repairing the barbed wire. Barbed wire was a relatively new invention. It came out of the American open range where they were trying to look for cheap ways to enclose ranches. And this was really problematic though, because if you're now facing a machine gun, which is our second invention here, you're trying to run across no man's land, but you've got all this barbed wire in the way, right? And so people would get caught up on this. And frankly, you couldn't dodge a machine gun all that well anyway, but this was just another way that it slowed people down. So this is one of the ways in which the war becomes what we call a war of attrition, or basically a stalemate. You're wearing the other guy down, not really able to strike an offensive. So those are our two big new inventions. There are more inventions that will come along during the war. These guys in the machine gun, with the machine gun, are wearing masks, so chemical weapons would be used during the war. You'd also see the invention of tanks in 1916, which were an attempt to kind of actually finally cross these trenches, and we'll talk about those in more depth later. The other thing I want to point out is how industrialization had really changed the nature of war. So looking back at the Napoleonic Wars, this is a painting of Napoleon on the battlefield. And I want to focus in on the troops in the back. Do you see how they're all lined up, kind of in formation, ready to march forward, right? Okay, so that's how wars had been fought. That's how wars would continue to be fought. That's how the generals would still think of things, and yet if you throw a machine gun in there, they're really just sitting ducks, right? So this change in the nature of war did not have a corresponding change in the strategy of war. So people were fighting with this old style with new technology, and it just led to mass slaughter. Now you throw in an artillery gun, and that really makes it all the more destructive, right? So now you can shoot these, the artillery from so far away, which were much more effective, much more destructive than cannons. And that's what leads to this kind of complete devastation. This is a painting from Otto Dix. It's actually the center of a 3-part painting, which is huge, by the way. I saw it in Berlin once, and it was, the size of like a chalkboard, I guess. Or a whiteboard. It was enormous and really just there was no defense. That's what would happen in this war, is people were just getting hammered and hammered and hammered. And the general would order you to go over the top out of the trench, and you would just get immediately slaughtered. And so this kind of devastation became kind of a common topic in Weimar paintings and post-World War I paintings in multiple countries. The next topic I want to talk about is this kind of overall culture of violence. Now, I don't think a lot of textbooks talk about this. This is basically based on a book called Dueling by Kevin McClear. But I think that a lot of books do talk about this culture of violence in a more roundabout way. So that's why I give it as a specific cause of the war. Dueling was the way that you solved issues. If somebody insulted your sister, you know, the biggest insult they could do was call her a slut, right? That she had not remained pure. And so for women to have honor, which was a very specific thing. To have honor meant that you could get married. It meant that if you were a man, that you could get jobs, that positions would become available to you. And to be someone with no honor would probably make you a social outcast. So for women, that meant remaining a virgin until marriage. And for men, that meant defending the honor of the female women in your family, defending your country. If there were slights to your nation, that was considered a duel-worthy offense. And defending your family in general. So dueling was really entrenched in France, in Germany, and in Austria-Hungary in particular. You also see it a lot in the American South. Andrew Jackson, for instance, was in a duel and had a lead bullet lodged in his body for most of his life from a duel as a young man. Of course, you Hamilton fans are familiar with duels to an extent. So this was very entrenched in culture. And this idea that you could solve slights to honor with violence, I think, is very coded in the discussions in the July crisis of 1914, that Austria wanted its honor satisfied, that Serbia had insulted them, and the only way to satisfy their honor was to declare war. So I think that these things are all related. This is a little bit harder to pin a specific event to, but I think very much an important way to look at why the war started. The other thing is, there had been all these short strategic wars, right? If you look at the wars of German unification, if you look at the wars of Italian unification, you want a little extra territory, you declare war on somebody, or, you know, get them to declare war on you. That solves your problems. Just to get into the dueling a little bit, academic dueling was called the Mensur in the fraternities, and the fraternities we talked about with the Carlsbad decrees in 1819, Metternich had tried to shut these down because it was too much a place where young men were discussing ideas he didn't like. So they were shut down. As part of the Carlsbad decrees, there was also censorship. The dueling they tried to repress too. It was outlawed, but it happened a lot in secret. And this was kind of the way you became a man. If you wanted to prove your manhood, you had to be in a duel. You had to defend your masculinity with a duel. And so these scars that you see on these men, for instance, were really kind of like, made them sort of sex symbols. All real men had these, it was called the Schmiss in German, these scars. So much so that they would like pick them and make the scars get bigger. So you see that kind of violence culture really ingrained in European culture. And that's where we're going to end off. So this is all the kindling and the blogs that we're building for this explosion that's about to happen, right? So the next thing we're going to look at is the spark. What happens on June 28th, 1914 that sets it all into mass destruction? 4 years, millions of deaths, economic ruin, landscape destroyed. Really a war unlike any that had been seen. Until that point, World War II would come along a few years later and be like, World War I. Watch, let's see what's next. So that's all I've got for today. Have a good night, guys, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.